Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Voice of Islam. My name is Amanda, and today we are discussing the topic, the European Union, the Hijab Ban. And we are very honored to have with us today Sister Maryam Ahmadoun, who's joining us today from Belgium. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Maryam.
Alaikum salam.
So, would you introduce yourself very briefly to the viewers, inshallah?
All right. First of all, thank you for having me on your show, by the way. My name is Maryam Ahmadoun, like you just said. I'm a senior policy officer with the Open Society Justice Initiative. I'm based in London, but I'm currently in Belgium visiting with my family after a year of lockdowns. And I have been working on different issues of what we might call institutional discrimination, structural racism. One of them is ethnic profiling, and another one is restrictions on religious dress that prevent Muslim women from accessing jobs, but also education, public space, etc. But my focus has been mostly on employment. So we've been following EU case law, national legal procedures around this topic, but also campaigns and stuff like that. Yeah.
MashaAllah, Jazakallah khair. That's incredibly important work that you're doing. Tabarakallah. And I'm sure many of our viewers have seen the headlines in recent weeks. Well, it's been about 4 or 5 weeks ago now, saying that a court in the EU has allowed women to be prevented from wearing the hijab at work. Now, needless to say, in the days following this ruling, social media was buzzing with debates and opinions on this so-called hijab ban. And I'm saying this in quotes because, we do see these headlines. Some of them are quite clickbaity, talking about, hijab banned at work in Germany and so on. And of course, because of this, we can't necessarily trust some parts of the mainstream media to give us the full story. And of course, social media is just awash with misinformation and rumors and gossip and so on. And for this reason, we would really like to hear from you, Sister Maryam, because you've been working in this area. We'd like to know, what is the real situation? Could you give us, before we discuss the rulings themselves, could you give us a bit of background information about the cases?
Right. Sure. I'd have to add that, I've been working on this issue with the Open Society Justice Initiative for a few years, but I've also been an activist on this issue for many more years. So if I give too much information, just pull me back a little bit, yeah?
No, that's fine.
But it's almost 20 years now. But I think a good place to start in terms of background information, I suppose, I would like to share 2 points, right? One is, I think it's important to understand what court we are talking about, what court gave a particular ruling. It is really important to understand that first. So we're talking about the Court of Justice of the EU, right? The Court of Justice of the EU, basically it's courts, national courts in member states, when they are presented with a certain case, when there's a legal proceeding before them, when part of that case kind of invokes EU law, they can refer this case to the Court of Justice to ask, how should we implement or how should we apply this particular law here if there's some kind of question that arises around it. So that is what the European Court of Justice does. It's actually cases that are referred by courts in member states. So it's not individuals that go to this court, right? It's not individuals that go to this court with their case and say, adjudicate this for me. It's actually, whilst they are when cases are in national courts and there's a question that arises around how we should interpret, how we should apply particular EU law, that national courts, so judges in these cases, refer their case to the CJEU and basically ask them, tell us how we should apply or how we should interpret this important piece of EU legislation. And in this case, the EU legislation that was really important is anti-discrimination law. So a particular piece of legislation that protects against discrimination in employment based on religion, right? So when this court comes out with its opinion about how you should interpret, how we should apply this law in these particular cases, of course, it applies to all of the EU, right? So a case may come from a particular country, but because the question is about how should we understand this law, how should we apply it in a particular case, it's about just how to basically understand this law. The ruling applies in all of the EU member states, so the 27. It's different from probably, I mean, especially people who have been following cases around religious dress restrictions, they've probably heard a lot about the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights, another important EU court that has given a lot of rulings about religious dress in public space, in education, in employment, everywhere, since probably 80s, 90s. Not so great rulings. This EU court, you can actually go as an individual to this court and say, my human rights are violated. I have gone through all of the steps in my own country. I've gone through all of the courts in my country, and I still feel that I didn't get a proper resolution. I still feel that my human rights are violated. So I come to you as European Court of Human Rights. And what is another difference is that the European Court of Human Rights basically its jurisdiction is much larger than the EU. It also includes it includes geographical Europe, so countries like Turkey and Russia and Iceland and Albania and stuff like that. So that's a different kind of court. It's important for people to understand that difference. We're talking about a ruling from the European Court of Justice, a court that actually immediately kind of influences the legal landscape in all of the EU. It basically tells all of the courts in all of the member states how they should apply this law when they're presented with this a certain case. So that's an important first.
But it is limited to the member states then?
Member states, yeah, exactly. It is limited to member states. But I mean, that's interesting, right? I mean, it's exactly because it's limited to this smaller region, right? The European Union, that this court is known to be kind of a little bit more bold. It's known for being usually a little bit more protective, sets higher standards, because it doesn't have to take into account what more than 40 countries, like the cultures and the context is in more than 40 countries, like the European Court of Human Rights, you know?
I see.
So that's why.
So what has happened in this case? Yeah. So, but as you've said, individuals don't take their courts to the European Court of Justice. They don't take their complaints to the European Court of Justice. This is something that the judges have referred to the court. So what has happened in this case? I mean, from what we read in the papers here in the UK, I don't know what was published in other countries, obviously. We have two women who were in separate companies and in separate incidents ordered to remove their hijabs at work when they had started wearing them after having worked for these companies for some time.
Yeah.
And the European Court of Justice.
Both came back from parental leave, wanted to wear a headscarf, and were refused. One of the companies had basically, when the person was on parental leave, adopted a strict neutrality policy that banned religious dress. The other one basically said, we've always had this policy, and you've started wearing a headscarf, but we don't allow it. And you just can't wear it, and both were suspended because of this. And both
suspended, but not terminated.
We're going to see what is going to happen now, right? Because if they're right, what is going to happen after the final ruling? Yeah.
So these two women took their cases to national courts in Germany.
So in one case it was the Hamburg Labor Court, the other one was the Federal Labor Court. Yeah, different courts, two different courts in Germany. And both judges, both courts decided that they needed to refer these cases to the CJAU. And if I may, that brings me actually to the other point that I wanted to make earlier that is really important to understand. So I said that the European Court of Justice basically tells these judges how they should interpret this law, how they should apply it in these particular cases, right? Now, this is not the first time that cases of Muslim women wearing headscarf in employment, on the job, being even dismissed for it, have been referred to the European Court of Justice. As I said before, most cases have always gone to the European Court of Human Rights, but we've actually had, for the first time, cases go to the European Court of Justice already. And a ruling about that, the first ruling that came out about that was in 2017. And it's actually that ruling that was kind of really detrimental and earth-shattering. And the reason why German courts had to actually refer new cases, because German courts already were presented with cases where Muslim women were barred from wearing religious dress at work, and they basically pushed back against it. They were basically saying, well, they were basically asking companies, well, why do you need a neutrality policy? Like, explain exactly how it is relevant for your company. Can you show that there's a specific risk of women wearing religious dress, wearing a headscarf to your business? Like, can you show this? And most of the time, companies were not able to show this, and these cases were just settled with Muslim women receiving compensation. There's even other cases in public employment, even where German courts have basically rejected this idea and basically said you cannot just have a blanket ban on religious dress unless you can show there's an actual harm, there's an actual link between wearing religious dress and public harm or whatever, or that it's in some way harmful to neutrality. If you can't actually show this, then you're just making assumptions about Muslim women who wear religious dress, that they are somehow not neutral, that they are somehow, just because they wear a headscarf, that they're somehow influencing others or oppressing others or whatever. We don't accept those assumptions because that's prejudice. We're pushing back against this. But the thing is, when the CJEU, so the Court of Justice of the EU, came out with that ruling in 2017, based on other two cases, surprise, surprise, also cases about Muslim women who were dismissed actually because they wore a headscarf. Also not surprising for us who follow this topic. Two cases one from France, one from Belgium, the number one and number two countries that have the most religious dress restrictions, right?
Yes.
They were referred to the Court of Justice with I think, the kind of hope that the European Court of Justice, which is known to be more bold, more progressive, and really kind of not and setting high standards when it comes to anti-discrimination and really protecting discriminated against groups, because they really kind of aim to encourage equality and pluralism, inclusion in the European Union. When they were presented with cases about Muslim women who wear a headscarf, they kind of went a different way. The ruling that came out in 2017, I know there was a lot of buzz around this ruling, but it's the 2017 ruling that was actually the most problematic. That sets the tone, right? The 2017 ruling, and that ruling, the court had already said that if employers wish to portray an image of neutrality to customers, that they can ban signs of religious, political, philosophical beliefs or convictions, as long as they apply it equally to all faith groups, and as long as it is only in absolutely necessary, meaning only in customer-facing jobs. So basically, you can hire Muslim women if they're in the back office where no one sees them, because that's okay. Right. But where they're visible, no. If you want to portray an image of neutrality, then it's okay to just ban religious dress in front office. That was a 2017 ruling based on a case. And that court ruling was, and I mean, paraphrasing legal experts. Now, this is not my opinion. One of the most criticized legal rulings on anti-discrimination by the European Court of Justice, because it is so it really departed from its own previous case law, from its own kind of tradition of really setting high standards of and protecting discriminated against groups. But of course, I mean, judges are just human beings, right? And Europe, we know there's an increasing problem with Islamophobia. We know that this issue is really highly controversial. And we hope, I mean, a lot of people hope that the bold European Court of Justice would just do what it normally does, but it didn't.
Well, so now I have a question here, and I'm just saying this obviously as somebody who has zero legal expertise, but this word that keeps getting used, neutrality, is a very vague word. Neutral in what sense? I mean, they're saying political, social, philosophical, and so on, but you know, religion is as a very political tool, clearly, in these courts, whereas the idea of, I mean, I'm just a bit confused, because obviously we're talking about societies which profess to be secular, meaning that religion is a private matter. So therefore,
secular doesn't necessarily mean that religion is a private matter, because what this court also immediately says in the beginning, it says, I mean, your freedom of religion, absolutely important. We have to protect against discrimination. I mean, against discrimination and a violation of freedom of religion. And freedom of religion includes the manifestation of your beliefs. So if you practice your beliefs in a public way, that's also protected. It all falls, but because employers also have freedom to conduct business, they basically, if they want to portray neutrality towards customers, then that's also fine. What legal scholars have said is that they have gone, they did not properly weigh these two rights. They have given so much weight to the freedom to conduct business of employers and did not even bother to offer any protection to the groups that are actually facing discrimination here. And that's what anti-discrimination law is supposed to do. It's supposed to protect the weakest group in this equation, not the powerful employers, but the minorities that are discriminated against, that are excluded from employment. But now back to your question about neutrality. You have to, I mean,
to my mind, just speaking logically, to my mind, neutrality would mean having employees who are displaying a diverse, you know, the diversity of the population, meaning, you know, to my mind, that's what it should mean, that you're not favoring one.
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
indifferent.
You're indifferent to people's. Exactly. That could also be being secular could also just mean that. But this is also something that is very interesting, is that the court doesn't really go into this concept of neutrality. It just accepts it at face value, that neutrality means not having any visible religiosity or any kind of, I mean, and they say political, philosophical beliefs, but what does that really mean? I mean, everything about our dress and the way we look can be perceived and interpreted as political. And what is neutrality exactly? I mean, is it neutral when people all look the same way? I mean, not to me. When all people look according to a particular norm that is not my own. I mean, it's not really, and the court kind of bypasses, it just accepts neutrality according to the status quo. Neutrality that actually benefits people who are secular, who are atheists, or people who do not hold beliefs that require them, or of which it is part to wear religious dress, to practice your religion in a particular way that is visible. So for us, this seeming neutrality preserves a status quo that is already exclusionary and discriminatory, and the court kind of just acts as if that's not the case, as if we are preserving a situation that is equal to all, because what they say is, as long as you ban all religious signs, you know, it applies to all religious groups, then that's fine. But it doesn't, because it just religious religious practice is different differs between different groups. And when you ban religious dress, obviously you're kind of according preferential treatment to people who don't hold beliefs that require them to wear religious dress, right? So there's something discriminatory, and they basically say, well, no, that's not the case. That's not how we see it, period. And they've been criticized a lot for this.
And it's interesting that these rulings are happening in countries where really there's only one group of people who wear ostensibly religious garments, which is Muslim women. I mean, we're not, I mean, how can I say this? In these countries, maybe nuns and priests might wear ostensibly religious garments, but obviously could be said to be part of their work. And so it's not an issue. You don't see so frequently, you don't see Christian people or people of the Jewish faith wearing very religious garments. I mean, you would see maybe, conservative Jewish people wearing traditional garments, but it's not as common as Muslim women and how we dress if we adopt the hijab. So it just seems to me that this ruling is targeting Muslim women, even though in the wording it just says religious dress. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, okay, there's 3 different things that I would say to that. First of all, if you look at how and when these dress restrictions or bans on religious, philosophical, political science in the name of neutrality started to pop up, and in what context they were called into life exactly to bar Muslim women who were perceived as wearing this oppressive kind of symbol or and all political debates were also about how we need to push back against this, how these we need to stop these Muslim women because they're oppressing, they're enforcing their ways on us. So when you track these when these and how these religious dress restrictions started in different countries, they were always completely steeped in these political debates about Muslim women being oppressed and the rejection of any kind of other interpretation and any other kind of meaning, and rejection of Muslim women, rejection of Muslims in general. Often even these, when you trace debates about these particular restrictions in their local context, people don't talk about bans on religious dress. People talk about the headscarf ban, about the face veil ban, about bans, because everyone knows what they're about. Everyone knows what the intention is. And this is something that because I disagree with the fact that it doesn't actually impact, for example, Sikh men, of which there are less in continental Europe than Muslim women, or Jewish men who wear a kippah. It does, but even they, and they've mentioned this in discussions, but also in public interviews, acknowledge that they are just collateral damage of policies that were intended to target Muslim women, to target Muslims. So when you trace back these political debates, there are even bans that were originally called headscarf ban, and then they were rejected for being too explicitly discriminatory, and then basically the language would change into ban on religious dress to make it as general and as seemingly neutral as possible. Everyone knows what the intent is. That's one. 2, as I said, demographically, it's mostly Muslim women who basically outnumber the other religious groups that might also be impacted by this. But number 3, the most important one, is that the kind of businesses and the kind of sectors that are customer oriented, that are service oriented, retail and like the cases here, a child daycare center, a drugstore, things like that, they tend to be predominantly female. So if these sectors and businesses adopt bans on religious dress, and they're going to impact mostly the religious women, it's going to be Muslim women who wear a headscarf that are predominantly impacted. So for all of these different reasons, it is absolutely clear that it is mostly Muslim women who are the target and who are also disproportionately impacted, right?
Yeah.
But that is also something that is kind of, they acknowledge it. They say, well, there might be some, and I think in this latest ruling, the exact word was inconvenience caused for a particular group, right? But because the aim is this great high aim of neutrality, it is acceptable. And again, as long as it applies equally, in theory, in as long as the wording, right, as long as the policy in theory applies equally to all groups, it is not discriminatory. But in practice, it disproportionately impacts Muslim women. In practice, it is called into light exactly, or they're introduced exactly because of this increasing Islamophobia in different countries. People just don't want to see a Muslim woman. They don't want to be. They don't want to engage with Muslim women who are religious. And I'm talking about a minority here. This is not necessarily the view of the majority populations, right? Because there have been surveys as well in different countries where people basically say, we don't mind if Muslim women wear religious dress, but political elites and the political discourses in countries create this idea that Muslim women are a threat, that they should be made invisible in this way, and certain companies, not all, certain companies feel that they should go along. Certain customers, clients might also be of that idea and make complaints to businesses, encouraging them to ban Muslim women who wear religious dress. But of course, all of the people who stand for a different kind of society where we do engage with difference, where we do engage with each other irrespective of our different backgrounds, they're kind of silenced. And yeah, that is a problem.
I mean, I have to say that when I read these headlines that came out, it was quite, I don't want to say shocking, because it wasn't shocking as such, but it was quite disappointing because, of course, we've become sort of, I hate to say this, but we have become sort of accustomed to the, hearing about France and Switzerland banning the niqab, for example, and we hear things saying, ban the burqa and all of that. And they couch this in under the excuse of, well, it's for security. We have to be able to see people's faces and so on and so forth. And we're sort of accustomed to that. And the niqab is such a minority. It's such a tiny minority of sisters who actually do wear it, that you sort of think, well, it's ridiculous, they're making laws about this. But this is actually a ruling that can impact millions of women, perhaps not the majority of Muslim women, but a large number of Muslim women who do wear the hijab. It's not talking about the niqab, we're talking about the actual hijab, just the headscarf even.
Just the headscarf,
Yes, and it does actually bring up a huge cause for concern, because you think, okay, well, if they can make a ruling about this under the guise of neutrality, what else can they rule on? SubhanAllah.
I mean, let's not even go there to what might come next. But
this is why we've got you on to discuss this now.
Yeah. No, I completely agree that this situation in itself is really already so terribly, awful, because we're talking about women's employment chances.
Exactly.
Your ability to kind of provide for yourself and your household or your family, your ability to achieve economic, financial independence, your ability stopped often in the name of your freedom, right? It's kind of coded in this language of neutrality, but when you scratch under the surface, especially in different political debates in member states, they start with neutrality. Often the second line is about oppression and freedom of, we need to free these women, we need to kind of stop this. How is that possible? And again, this one is about employment, but we've seen many cases about education as well, where Muslim women, Muslim girls from higher education and secondary education are rejected because they wear a headscarf, with what we see then Muslim women changing study tracks, going for homeschooling, having to kind of adopt all these different kind of coping mechanisms to just survive, seeking education, accessing employment, doing the most basic things that help advance and empower women. And in the name of their liberation, they're stopped from doing exactly this, just because they dress a certain way, just because they look a certain way, right? And because of all of these assumptions, Islamophobic assumptions that are associated with the way they look. And the court had a chance to just stop this, because the point is, I mean, there's this assumption that is made in this ruling, that just because you look religious, that you're somehow violating neutrality, that you're somehow not neutral, right? We were discussing earlier that neutrality could also just mean like everyone wears, practices their faith, makes themselves visible for who they are, as long as you don't harm anyone, as long as you don't, impose your views on another. You can regulate those kind of things. You don't have to ban everything to achieve that kind of situation. But no, the court went along with that idea that you just need to make everything invisible, ban all these things. And in their minds also, this is not too much to ask. Again, from this dominant perspective, if we can ask, for example, I think this is what is often underlying. I mean, and this is if we assume they have the best intentions, right? We assume that they don't just want to reject Muslim women altogether. Is this idea of the Christian faith? It's so easy to just take off your cross, so it should be equally easy for a Sikh man to take off their turban, or a Muslim woman to wear to not wear a headscarf. They're two different things. They're two different things. One is a practice of a particular religion. One is a symbol of who you are. It's not necessarily part of that religious practice. People don't necessarily believe it is a mandated part of their religion, as is the case for Jewish men who wear kippah, Sikh men who wear turban, Muslim women who wear headscarf. We're talking about different things. But again, from this dominant perspective, there's just this assumption that it's all the same thing. And
it's
Muslim women shouldn't make a big deal out of it, right? It's just it's just a religious symbol. It's not.
But it's not, no. And I think that this is something that a lot of people don't realize, is that, a headscarf is not an accessory. Yes, there are women who try to match the color of their scarf to whatever they're wearing, but that doesn't make it an accessory. It's no more an accessory than our clothing is an accessory. It should be considered part of our clothing, the same way a Sikh man's turban should be considered part of his clothing. We, as Muslim women, we can't go out with it on, because it's very much part of our clothing, part of our basic garments in a way, for sisters who wear it. And I think that this is something that, as you said, they're not understanding. They're just seeing it as a symbol. And the irony being that it's seen as a tool of oppression. And women's voices are completely missing in this conversation for us to say that, no, it is not a tool of oppression. And in their drive to free us from this tool of oppression, they're actually further oppressing Muslim women.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, I'm not going to lie about it, right? I mean, everything can be oppressive. Whether it's wearing religious dress can be oppressed, not wearing religious dress can be a way to oppress, but it's not the only reason. And how can we create a kind of a context, a society where we can guarantee as much freedom as possible to people to make their own choices, and at the same time make sure that we provide people with opportunities and like education and employment and tools to, if they face oppression in any way, to also reject that, to fight that. That is the kind of society that we have to aspire. And what this ruling does, even in those cases where it might be a tool of oppression, you're not necessarily liberating anyone, right? You're just creating, adding another layer of oppression on top, right?
Exactly.
So is and on the side, creating more, adding more oppressed women to the equation who actually wear this out of their own choice.
Exactly.
So yeah, this is what the court has had already decided in 2017, and that the German courts questioned. They questioned this, and that's why they referred two new cases now, because they, and if you read the way they phrase their questions and the way they argue their questions to the Court of Justice, you can sense that they do not agree with the 2017 rule. So you have courts in national member states who don't agree with what the European Court of Justice came out with their interpretation, and they're trying to push back and tell them, like, are you sure this is not direct discrimination? Are you sure this is not indirect discrimination? Like, I mean, you're basically saying that if a woman wears a turban or something like that, or a scarf for fashion reasons, then that is okay. That because that doesn't fall under this neutrality policy. But if she wears it for religious reason, then it's okay to ban her. Isn't that the exact thing that this EU anti-discrimination law is supposed to protect against? And they added all these other questions about, well, they basically said, we do things differently in Germany. We don't just accept this at face value. We demand from companies to show that there's specific harm, to explain how this neutrality policy is absolutely necessary for them. They need to provide evidence, and if they can't, then we see this as simple discrimination, and we stand with Muslim women. So how are we going to balance our national kind of regulations, our constitutional provisions that actually offer more protection to these religious minorities, with what you just said in 2017 in ruling about how to interpret this EU law? Because EU law is, of course, takes precedence in this case in this subject over national law. So they're just how are we going to balance this? And this new ruling, there's kind of some new additions that were added to what was already decided in 2017. So, and that is interesting to look into as well.
So, question then, have there ever been any cases, I don't know if you know the answer to this, and I'm just throwing this out randomly, but have there ever been any cases of companies successfully proving that neutrality was necessary, excuse me, that neutrality was necessary for their business, and that there was an actual harm for women wearing hijab in their workplace? Or is this all theoretical so far?
So first of all, to my knowledge, and I try to follow what is happening around this issue in all of the EU member states, only German courts were asking these kind of questions. I think in the Netherlands, would also kind of systematically push back against these in a very forceful way by basically questioning the same things. But they I don't think they've ever asked companies to actually produce evidence. They basically kind of just rejected these kind of things. But German courts have asked this kind of evidence, and to my knowledge, there hasn't been a company that has ever been able to provide any kind of evidence. But in the case that was referred, in one of the cases, there were some attempts. In one of the cases that I think it was a Hamburg court that was referred to the European Court of Justice, this company was saying, well, actually, with this woman wearing a headscarf, I think they were saying that we noticed that when we allow religious dress, that parents who actually prefer to have this strict neutrality environment, that they don't enroll the siblings of their children anymore. So we see harm to our business. But then the question that arises for me is then, okay, but what about the customers you gain because you allow religious diversity? Like, are we taking those into account as well, and who's keeping track of that? Because we know there have been companies like, for example, I mean, in a very public and visible way, IKEA had one of its employees who wear a headscarf attacked online, and there was this customer who basically said, I refuse to shop at IKEA anymore because you have this employee with a headscarf. And IKEA basically pushed back and said, well, we allow our employees to wear their religious dress as part of we just integrate it into the uniform. If you have a problem with that, then basically bye.
Yeah.
And there was so much support for that from other customers, from other people. So what is harm to your business exactly? Like, who's going to be calculating, like, what customers are lost, what customers are gained, what is the tally in the end? Like, how are courts going to be judging this? Are they going to just take it at face value? If a company comes and says, well, I lost a few customers because they don't want to be confronted with religious signs or whatever religious manifestation in my business, you're going to probably have a lot of judges who are like, good enough. You can have your neutrality policy, and you're going to have other courts, other kind of judges in other kind of contexts who are probably going to push back against that and maybe ask more questions and more. It's going to be pretty random, but it basically just adds another layer of complexity to a situation that was already really hard to litigate for Muslim women. Because you have to imagine, I mean, this is important to know when it comes to employment. There's not a lot of employment cases, aside from, I mean, despite the fact that a lot of Muslim women are impacted by religious dress restrictions, by these headscarf bans in employment. It takes a lot from Muslim women to actually take legal action, because they know they will face professional repercussions for the rest of their life because of this, because they actually took a company or their employer to court. I mean, they try to kind of like hide this by making cases anonymous and stuff like that, but still, it's really kind of, I mean, it's possible to find out sometimes who took cases to court. And also it's just really, really draining. It requires a lot of energy, a lot of resources. And these women just want to work. They just want to work. They want to contribute to society. They want to be economically and financially independent. They want to make a living. And they have to go through this entire battle to just exist in the way they are, as a tiny minority within a minority that happens to be visibly religious, right? It's just, it's really hard. And this, although the courts kind of presented this as an added protection, right? So what is new about this ruling? So 2017 basically said, if employers just wish to portray an image of neutrality, that's enough. Then they can ban religious dress, because a policy of neutrality is legitimate and justified, whatever. Now, with these questions that came from these German courts that pushed back against this and said, well, we have higher standards, and you're basically kind of like lowering our standards, they've added this in this new ruling, this new element that you have to. So again, it is not discriminatory if employers ban signs of religious, philosophical, political beliefs, if they aim to pursue an image of neutrality towards customers, as long as they apply it equally and only when it's necessary. Again, this assumption of back office being okay, front not. And as long as they can demonstrate a genuine need, as long as they added this element, which wasn't part of the 2017 ruling, because there was just, if you wish it, you can do it. Now you have to actually demonstrate that you have a genuine need. And what is a genuine need? They also make this explicit. One, if basically customers or clients express that they would like for the business to be neutral, or for the kind of for there to be neutrality, for there to not be kind of visible religiosity. We do not question why. We do not question whether these customers are just prejudiced or whether they actually reject Muslims and Muslim women. We don't question that. As long as they express that there's this wish, then that's a genuine need. And another genuine need, which is new, is to prevent social conflicts amongst employees. Another complex dimension. What does that even, I mean, yeah. So if
basically,
or a debate arises on the job around someone's, I don't know whether it's going to be headscarf or around religion in general, because actually the case where this question was asked, the judge was very clear to say this company says that they have a neutrality policy because they had conflicts in the past about religion, but none of them had anything to do with headscarves or religious dress. It was just about religion. So it's interesting that the European Court of Justice suddenly slips in this idea of, well, if there's social disputes that arise among employees, then that's also a genuine need. And that's also a good reason to impose a neutrality policy. So you know what happens here? That means this, and it's an absolutely crazy notion already, right? This idea of back office. That's already something that you can criticize because it's just completely insane in the 21st century that a court can actually has the audacity to say it is completely justified to hide this religious minority in the back office. As long as no one sees them, that's perfectly okay. But with this added element of social disputes, well, those can arise in the back office as well, right? Those can arise everywhere. So if you want to ban religious dress because you have this genuine need of trying to prevent conflicts amongst employees, for whatever reason, because there's some debate about religion, which there always is in societies with increased oppression against these religious minorities, the solution is just to ban them, to ban religious dress, to make them invisible, or by adopting these policies, basically barring them or banning them from your workforce. I mean, because if for the Muslim women for whom this is really important, they're just not going to work in these places, right? And we already know that. We already know that there's a lot of Muslim women who change their study tracks, who change their career paths, who go into self-employment, who leave their countries because they feel that this rejection, that not being able to be who they are, is just intolerable, and they adopt these different strategies. So we already know that this happens, and this is a situation that the highest court in the EU, that is known for normally being so protective and so bold, has created for Muslim women. They have made the situation even worse than it already was in certain member states that were actually pushing back against these kind of policies.
I mean, they have essentially given power to racists in this particular part, because they're saying that if there's going to be conflict amongst your staff, that is a reason to impose neutrality. But the conflict isn't going to come from the minority. The conflict is going to come from the majority trying to impose their views, objecting to the fact that there is a minority in their presence. And, that's not going to solve the problem. That's just empowering prejudice. That's just empowering discrimination. That's insane. I'm sorry, but that's insane, and saying, okay, but as long as they remove their religious symbols. Okay, let's say, for example, that you have a Muslim sister who is wearing hijab, but isn't so attached to it and is willing to take it off for the sake of getting a job. Does it stop her being Muslim? If somebody's going to object to the fact that she's Muslim, they're going to object to that fact whether she's wearing a headscarf or not.
Which brings us to the point you made earlier, like, what's the end game here? Like, where are we going through? We're on a really, really slippery slope here. Like, how invisible are we going to make Muslims? Like, what's the end game of making them invisible, making them disappear? I mean, it's just, it's really insane. But yeah, that is absolutely the situation here. And to come back to the point you just made, we had already seen that we were already seeing especially in countries like France and Belgium, where there's constant debates about this one Muslim woman who wears a headscarf who happens to get a particular position somewhere. There's these national spectacles and witch hunts that are created around these Muslim women. We already see that in these cases. That these women are just, that they're just kind of trying to adopt these different strategies. That they're also one of the strategies that women also adopt is in their profession, when they actually manage to get through this concrete door, is what I call it, because we talk about feminists trying to kind of break the glass ceiling. We're trying to get through a concrete door, right?
Yeah.
They try to really, and it takes a lot of psychological energy, not talk about their faith, not kind of bring anything into the workforce, try to kind of like just be do their job with as limited discussions about their faith as possible. They're trying to kind of, it's just never enough. The problem is not with the way the minorities try to kind of like deal with these situations and try to kind of like survive these workplaces. Yeah, it comes from the powerful dominant groups, the loudest groups in society. And what we also see is that in these countries in particular, where you've had many of these debates, there've often been strategies from far-right groups, from right-wing kind of like extremist groups, to go into certain places and basically demand that Muslim women don't wear religious dress. And before, they would be very explicit about this, that they don't want to see this oppressive symbol. But what the European Court of Justice now has done, the court has basically told them, well, next time, don't say you just don't want to be confronted with a Muslim woman. Just say that you want a strictly neutral environment. Then that will be okay. Then you can pass it. So they've basically provided a roadmap to these groups that we're supposed to kind of like fight if we want an open and pluralist and inclusive society where people are treated fairly, where everyone has a chance to really contribute and live their life in a dignified way and enjoy equal rights. They've emboldened them. They've provided them with a roadmap to fight for their kind of society and get away with it legally too.
That's very frightening, really, when you think of what path we're setting ourselves on with this.
It's sad. It is frightening, particularly for Muslim women and Muslims in general in continental Europe, where things have the past 10 years, 20 years, but the past 10 years, the past 5 years have been particularly, the situation has become particularly bad in terms of, we're talking discrimination in employment through the use of religious dress restrictions. But everyone who works on Islamophobia knows there's like a range of policies that target Muslims and Muslim women, and that discriminate against them, that exclude them from society, whether it's in housing, whether it's in public space, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in education. Like, you're kind of, it's difficult to be a Muslim in continental Europe and not feel constantly stuck in this spider web of restrictions and violations of your rights, and just kind of try to exist. So this is just, it just kind of adds to that. But the thing is that I think what is important here is to not fall into the trap of seeing this as a us versus them problem, meaning Muslims versus non-Muslims problem, because that's the reality that they want to create, that the people who push for these kind of restrictions, they want to create. We have to understand that there are many other people, many other groups, many allies who want to fight for a particular kind of society where people are left in their have dignity, where they can enjoy their basic human rights and their civil rights, where people have freedom, where people Don't take offense just because you look a certain way. And that is the battle that we're fighting here. The battle is not Muslims versus non-Muslims. That's what they want to create. The battle
Absolutely.
is between people who want to have a particular kind of society and people who reject that kind of society that is open and pluralist and inclusive and where people are treated in a dignified and fair way. When you look at it that way, there's so many alliances that you can build with other groups. I mean, because we're talking about the Islamophobia, discriminatory policies against Muslims, but there's a lot of other communities in continental Europe that have been facing increasing discrimination and racism. When we talk about, I mean, and again, from the perspective of these oppressive systems, of course, they make us believe that these communities are all different, right? That there's Black community, that there's a Muslim community, that there's LGBT community, that there's Roma community, but obviously these groups intersect, right? That there's a community of differently abled people that are disabled by our society. These are all groups that intersect. And I think we need to look at all of these groups, all of these people that are fighting for the same kind of society where they can, again, just live as human beings, be visible in the way they are, whether it's with women with their natural Black hair that also face rejection by employers because they are told to straighten it, which is mind-boggling, right?
Yes.
Or who are differently abled, who are rejected from certain workplaces, or people different sexuality, people of a certain age and stuff like that. It's these groups. This is our us. And this us is much, much bigger. And this us also includes people from the kind of white majority secular population. There's a lot of people who don't support these kind of policies, who don't support this kind of society, where every trace of difference is made invisible, is erased. They actually want to engage with people who are different, people who've actually taken lessons from this, from the anti-racism or Black Lives Matter movement, who've taken lessons from Me Too, who've taken lessons from this entire COVID reality that has exposed structural racial inequalities, and who want a different kind of society. I think for me, it's really important, having worked on this topic for so long, having fought so many of these kind of restrictions and also other forms of discrimination that affect people, other kind of minorities. I think this is really important, to not fall into the trap of seeing this as a problem of only of Muslims or Muslims against non-Muslims. It's not. That's the reality they want to create. It is a struggle between people who are for a particular society and people who reject that kind of society. And I think if we look at it that way, there's so many alliances we can build. There's businesses who are really kind of for this kind of society, but who, again, because of increasing Islamophobia, are kind of hesitant to kind of, so to speak, come out of the closet with their attitudes, right? And kind of show that they are supportive. There's a lot of companies, I know, Belgium, we used to have a lot of these companies who were like, we hire Muslim women with a headscarf. Just don't tell anyone, right? Just don't say anyone.
Like it's like an underground almost.
They're even afraid. So it's really important that, for example, we also encourage these businesses like an IKEA, like an H&M, like there's so many others, especially the big ones who are not afraid to lose that one or two customer who don't want, that they come out, that we have to encourage them to come out and really support all these kind of and celebrate difference and show that the world does not come to an end. Your business does not collapse when you allow it. So I think, I mean, that's the way we need to be thinking. And and of course, we need to keep going to court, but not only going to court. We need to combine it with all of these other things. Yeah.
We are actually nearly out of time, and I am really disappointed because this is such a fascinating discussion and I've got so many more things I want to talk about with you. But just one last question. After we saw these headlines coming out a few weeks ago, there were things like petitions circulating, calls to boycott German products and things like this. And I'm just wondering, practically speaking, What can we do? And again, I'm not talking about just Muslims, not even just Muslims in the EU. I'm talking about all fair-minded people who might be watching this, who might be thinking that these rulings are wrong, this attitude is wrong. What can we do collectively and individually to push back against this?
I mean, I think the things that I was just saying, I mean, just to comment on something very practical that you just said, just boycotting German products sounds really weird when it's German courts who try to push back against these.
I know,
this
is the thing. When I saw that, I thought,
yeah. But I mean, even I don't know, petitions, unless there's like a really concrete ask that goes to people who actually have the power to make certain decisions, petitions usually don't go far. But I think what I just said, I think it's the long-term work, it's the harder work, but it's actually the work that I think will benefit you in the long term, is to build these alliances, to really kind of make these connections with different oppressed communities and think through the kind of society that you want. And this means not only kind of understanding how all these policies and how all these discourses target and oppress Muslims, but also make an effort to understand how other groups are oppressed and targeted in a very sophisticated way, how we're kind of like often also kind of pitted against each other, and just oppose this kind of really make it clear what kind of society that you want, where everyone is free, where everyone enjoys their rights, where everyone lives a dignified life, where someone is not attacked, because we see a lot of these kind of discriminatory policies also encourage hate crimes against particular groups, where people are not attacked for who they are, to kind of fight this society, fight this kind of these ideas with more allies. Also, I mean, groups of workers, because what this ruling also does is give a lot of power to employers over workers. So exploring that idea, thinking about working with unions and things like is really important. Think out of the box, build a broad-based alliance and fight for this kind of society. But also, I think it's really important to keep going to courts, but not in an isolated way. Because what I feel kind of, not with bad intentions, but what happened here is that individuals go to court. These cases are referred to the CJU, and of course, their ambition is to make these discriminatory policies stop by taking their own personal case, without connecting it to a movement within your country or within different communities, a movement on the ground. Going to court when it comes to these kind of highly controversial matters, without making sure that it's connected to a struggle on the ground, to mobilizing, to campaigning, to advocacy with policymakers. You have to work on every level. Without that, usually is ineffective, because what you're going to get is just judges that reproduce the ideas that already exist in the society that you're trying to challenge, because they don't, I mean, in best case scenario, they don't know any better. Their views haven't been challenged. So going to court has to always be rooted in a bigger struggle for change. And you have to work. You have to really work, because it takes a lot of effort to build those movements on the ground in different countries that come up with creative campaigns, that engage with companies, that engage with all of these different stakeholders. But those, in the end, will be most effective. We've seen this on different kind of issues, and even on religious dress restrictions in particular regions, in particular member states. This is how to go about it best, but it takes a lot of effort, and that's why it's so important to build these broad-based alliances. Because if Muslim women, again, this tiny group of Muslim women go about it alone, it is incredibly, I mean, it's already hard to live with the experience of being directly discriminated against, being on the front line, having to also engage in this legal struggle, having to also kind of lead this. It's just detrimental.
Exhausting.
I mean, it's exhausting. It really destroys people. It's really important to do this as a collective And for that, you have to
Absolutely.
identify your community, your collective, and that collective consists of people who want a particular kind of society. It does not consist of people of a particular faith or a particular background, or particular ethnicity, or particular. It consists of people who are for a particular kind of society.
Mhm.
So I think that's the way to go, even if it's the hardest.
Subhanallah. As they say, there's power in numbers. So if we have such a collective, it takes the onus, it takes the weight off the shoulders of our Muslim sisters and shares it out and makes it easier. I mean, I'm just thinking as a Muslim woman, if I ever face discrimination at work, would I have the energy? Would I have the mindset? Would I have the tenacity to take it to court, to fight it? And when I hear these cases, I
They
think,
take
oh,
years. Don't
they
forget,
take
they
years.
take years. Yeah.
Exactly, you
And
know,
resources.
subhanallah.
Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
subhanallah. It is daunting, but collectively, it's a lot less daunting if you know
Especially
that
when
you
it's
have
rooted
a movement that
in a
has your back.
movement.
Exactly,
Absolutely.
yeah.
When these messages are really kind of amplified, when you question, because listen, all these things that we were discussing about what judges were saying, you were shocked. I'm sure there's a lot of more people, if they were actually aware of what's happening, what these courts, what these judges are saying, that they would be shocked. But it kind of gets lost because there's no coordinated collective movement in especially continental Europe. And there's practical reasons for that, right? All of these language differences, all of these different kind of national contexts, but it's possible.
Yes,
I think it's
subhanallah.
possible if you kind of exert effort. It's possible to push back against this.
Ya Rab, may Allah give strength to our sisters who are facing this discrimination and enable us to push back against these policies. Because at the end of the day, they are simply harmful. They're harmful for all of society, not just for Muslim women in hijab. They're harmful
Yeah,
for all of society.
I mean, think about the lesson. This global pandemic is so fascinating. The lessons it has given us, and also like the climate problem of climate change. What have we learned? That we need everybody. That we need to work together. One person protecting themselves or working for themselves, it does not solve the problem.
Doesn't work.
We need to
No.
work as a collective. We need everyone to be on board. We need everyone to be active. This is not a time to come up with policies or to justify and legitimize legally policies that exclude people from certain spaces, that exclude people from employment. This is the time to oppose those kind of restrictions. And for an EU that comes out politically to be in favor of this inclusion and pluralism and against racism and wanting to address all these issues in a collective way to allow for these kind of court rulings to come out is just, I mean, very hypocritical and kind of and mind-boggling, actually. Yeah,
it is, subhanallah. Sister Maryam, I have to say we have gone over time, and it has been amazing discussing this issue with you today. Thank you so much for coming on and for sharing your knowledge of the topic with us. It is, you know, headlines were calling it a hijab ban. It's clear now, okay, it's not an outright ban, but it is a hugely problematic ruling. It's such an important topic, not only to discuss, but also to understand in depth. And I just want to say to you, Jazakallah khair for coming on and clarifying so much of the issue for us. Before we go, do you have any last words of advice to the audience that you'd like to impart?
I think, yeah, as I said, the most important thing for me and the one thing that I've learned being in this field and challenging these kind of restrictions for a little less than 20 years now is exactly just this. Don't fall into the trap of seeing this as a Muslim versus non-Muslim issue. Build your collective, find your community of people that want a society where people are free, where people live with dignity, where people enjoy their fundamental rights, where all people can contribute. And I just want to encourage people to be really creative, because that is something that these judges and these policymakers that encourage and these businesses that encourage these kind of policies don't have. They don't have the creative imagination to even envision a workplace or a society that is able to live with this religious difference or all of these kind of differences, whether it's racial, ethnic, language, nationality, religious, ability, sexual, all of these kind of differences, we are able to be creative and come up with this kind of society. And even if the transition is sometimes difficult, because we will fight, we will have discussions, we will not understand, we'll have miscommunication. At the end of the day, we are able. If we are not, then there's a problem, then humanity has a problem. We are absolutely able to creatively imagine this kind of society, bring it into life. There are examples that already in the world that already come close, really close to these kind of realities. We just don't see them enough in continental Europe. But yeah, I want to encourage people to really just be creative, build a collective, and challenge these kind of exclusionary, discriminatory, often blatantly racist policies.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note that, the fact of the matter is, right-minded, good-minded people are the majority, and so we shouldn't be afraid to speak out. Like you were saying, those companies are a bit hesitant to say
they're not the
that they hire
right now, but they are.
We need to
absolutely
be the
majority.
loudest. Yes, but we do need to be the loudest and to not be afraid to be the loudest and not to be afraid to speak up. Absolutely. Sister Maryam Ahmadoun, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. Jazakallah khair for coming on. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. Please do share this video. Once we're done, it will be available on our Facebook and our YouTube page, as well as on our website. But for now, we've gone well over time. I could talk for another hour, subhanAllah, but I think we need to draw a line here. Jazakallah khair to all of you. This has been Voice of Islam, coming to you from the UK and Belgium this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are in the world. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.